Hello and welcome to another episode of Taking Back Saturday, a Happy Buyers Club podcast where we break down the real estate market each and every Friday and help home buyers build confidence, follow a process, and hopefully buy really happy. I'm on the other side of the desk again this week, and I'm joined by a man who may actually have the claim to fame of being the first buyer's agent in Brisbane. The rest of us are just copies. You've been doing this for nearly a decade. He's helped hundreds of families, investors buy the right property and now runs one of the biggest buyers agencies, not just in Brisbane, but in Australia. Darren Piper from Universal Buyers Agents. Welcome.
Mate, what an intro. I don't know if that makes me sound more experienced or old. Or a combination of both.
I got your batting average here, everything. We're ready to rock and roll.
We are. We're good to go. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us. This is now the third time we've tried to do this, but...
We have due to unforeseen circumstances, but we got there in the end, which is the main thing.
Everyone's healthy, everyone's happy, and here we are.
Yes.
So at the top of the show, you've been doing this a long time.
I have. So, essentially had Universal just over 8 years now. And I guess to extend on the comment about being, one of the first or
the OG,
the OG, so to speak. It's interesting because it comes up a lot. Like if you paint the picture, if you go back, 8 years ago or a touch over, there was probably only 500 or 600 buyers agents in the country, right? So very small, very niche. And I think back then, a lot of sales agents and people in the industry probably didn't think that the sector was going to last. Yeah. I very much took the opposite view, and glad that I did take that because, lo and behold, fast forward now, with a great business, a great team, and, the sector as a whole is thriving, so it's exciting.
What do you think's changed in that 8 years, other than real estate agents thinking that this won't last?
I think just the awareness and the education piece, largely. Back then it was a very different conversation, both with client and agent. The discussions with the agents back then were very much, I think that the perception was that you were there to share their commission, which is simply not the case, as we all know, because the buyer pays us direct. I think the other factor is that, people just outright didn't know that the service existed. I recall hundreds of conversations with potential clients or leads, whatever they were at that point in time, where you're really having to sell them on the service. And I find if you fast forward to now, it's not so much selling them on the service and the benefits, it's probably more why us as opposed to the next BA. So, I think a lot of people also take the view that the amount of competition that's entered the space is a negative. I know there's a lot of other buyers agents that think that that's the case. I know we
won't get them on the show.
No, I know we've spoken about this off camera before, but I see it as a really good thing because it just does put more spotlight on what we do as a whole. Like any form of business is going to be competition. You just have to be better than the next person.
I think competition breeds efficiencies and effectiveness, and you're forced to be better than you were 8 years ago, right? And I would hazard a guess to say you're probably better, and the organisation is better at what you do now than back then.
Absolutely. I think you've also, I know it's a cliche comment, but you've always have to take the student mindset, whether you're a buyer's agent, an associate, operations manager, property manager, sales agent, anyone in the sector or any form of business, there is always something to learn. And I learn new things every day, and that's the exciting part for me. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Let's talk about something to learn, right? So missing out. It's a big part of real estate. How do people learn? So let's say there's somebody listening to this, they've been looking for a month, they've just made an offer, it went to best and finals on a Monday afternoon, and missed it by that much.
Yeah.
How do they learn from that experience to make sure that ideally and hopefully it only happens once?
It's a really good question. I'll start by saying I think it's important to miss out. A lot of people probably take the opposite view because human nature prevails and you just want the win, so to speak. I think there's always something to learn, as I sort of touched on before, with every loss, so to speak. And I don't like to use the word loss. I think there's just a lesson in every scenario. I think if you're a buyer out there, and whether it's an auction campaign or a best offers buy, whatever it is, but you end up missing out, just really sit there and pull apart why. And a lot of people, I think the first thought process always goes to price. Right? Because price is something that every buyer can largely control if it's within the budget. But I think you've also got to look at it through the lens, like what could have I done different strategically to take the focus off price? Is there a price that stops it getting to the cutoff line? Is there a price that stops it going to market? Asking the agent what price points have been tested, right? To try and get a gauge on, where the seller's motivation is at. The best follow-up question to ask in that situation, so if I'm dealing with an agent and it's irregardless of how the property is being marketed, I'll say, look, just out of curiosity, have you had any offers during the campaign? If they turn around and say yes, I say, look, just out of curiosity, so we're not wasting each other's time here, what price points have been tested that have been knocked back? Because at that point, it's hard for them not to tell you that, because there's no reason not to tell you a price that hasn't been accepted.
Yeah. The last thing you want is that animosity of trying again and having the same result.
Correct. So hypothetically, the agent turns around and says, yeah, a buyer a week ago made an offer at $1,020,000 and it was just rejected. The best follow-up question to ask in that situation is, when that offer was put forward at $1,020,000, did their vendor engage? Did they counter? And if they did, what was their counter? And sometimes the agent will actually then disclose, oh, they countered at $1,070,000 right there, and then you know where the seller's at.
For sure.
So I think it's going to the discovery process, asking the right questions, how to ask, what to ask, and when to ask. That's where the lesson comes off the back of the loss, so to speak.
There's, I'm going to ask you a question about the market at the moment, because I think it's a really interesting market. By the time this comes out, there'll be sort of 4 weeks to Christmas, which is a fascinating time in the cycle every year. Mm-hmm. You mentioned there, like, test, ask the right questions, know when to ask. The obvious question that a lot of buyers in the marketplace will ask if they see a new property coming to market and it's best offers buy, and I feel like the 12th of November is kind of everyone's best offers buy date at the moment. Yeah, and there's a lot of auctions between the next couple of weeks. They always ask, will they sell before auction, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a right or wrong time to make a pre-auction offer or to try and take that property away before it's maybe offers closing date?
Yeah, I probably do find there is a sweet spot. So typically, let's say a normal campaign is 4 weeks, whether it's an auction campaign or best offers buy. Depending on the motivation of the vendor, which is really important to ascertain and find out why they're selling. And do they want to sell or do they need to sell? And they're two very different things, like a job and a career, right? 100%. But I think in that situation, what I've found over the years is week one of the campaign, the vendor doesn't really know where the market is, and they need to go through that process, have an open home, get some feedback. Because if you, as a buyer, shoot from the hip at the first open home, unless you're paying pretty significant money, right? That's where you can overpay. Whereas week 2 and week 3, I find is the sweet spot, because I've had some feedback. It's sat there for a little bit. Naturally, open home numbers will probably start to dilute a bit. But then on the tail end of that, if you're a couple of days out from auction, the only way you're going to take it off the market if they legitimately have no one. So week 2 and week 3 out of a 4-week campaign, I find is probably the best to get a deal done. But it really comes down to the agent selling it, how they operate, and they all do things differently, as we know, motivation of the vendor. And then also, when it comes to negotiating, again, just to sort of extend on the price thing that I mentioned before, like keeping price out of it, like really dig into the vendor's situation. If you're dealing with an owner-occ, as an example, and they need to sell and they're on the market, obviously, but haven't subsequently gone and bought that next place, like massage the terms. If you don't need to be in 30 days, offer them a 45, 60, 90. The sales agent might not like it, but ultimately it's the vendor's decision at the end of the day. That takes the focus off price. They feel like they've had a win, et cetera, right?
I think we were having this conversation between Chase and I and an agent mate of ours the other day, and he was saying that he hasn't done a 30-day settlement in nearly 6 months because the market's so tight that everybody is welcoming a little bit longer to hopefully make better decisions. He's like, I'm still getting extensions, like people asking for extensions out from 60 days or license agreements rent backs because they haven't gone and found. But the reason that the deal got tied up was because there was longer than 30 days put on the table. And I think testing those motivations, understanding them, it's a courageous thing, I think, for a buyer. Like we do it every day. So it's like, hey, why are they selling? Yeah. Come on, tell me the truth. Like what's really happening?
It's like driving a manual car, right? You just sort of hop in and get into it.
For sure.
It's second nature.
And then you learn, you call the assistant or you call the associate and you get more information out of them than maybe the lead agent. Right? Or maybe you start with them and you see where you go.
You can go around in some cases, that's for sure.
How do you build confidence as the sort of average punter? Again, you've been doing this for a month, right? You've missed out once. You go, shit, I've listened to Sam and Darren. They told me I've got to go and figure out motivations. How do you build confidence to ask those questions? And is there a better question to ask than why are they selling?
Look, that's a really good question. There's probably a handful of different ways to look at it, right? Like building confidence, I don't think is something that, unfortunately for a buyer, happens overnight. So number one, it's probably time in the market. You've got to go through enough scenarios and situations to, I guess, thicken the skin up, if you will. And that's the advantage, without trying to sound biased, with using a buyer's agent, right, is because we do it daily. Yeah. There's no emotion with us involved, right? But I think, when it comes to, I've always taken the view that, excuse me, that there's a difference between being sold a property and buying a property. Same outcome from a transactional point of view, but any buyer can walk into an open home and the price is $1 million and they go, I love it. They get emotionally charged or whatever it is, right? And then they essentially pay $990 or $1 million, feel like they've had an okay deal and just move on from it. That's being sold a property. Buying a property and buying a property well, as you know, there's a list a mile long of boxes that need to be ticked, right? So I think as a buyer, to try and build the confidence is just educate yourself on what that process looks like. So it is knowing what questions to ask, right? From a qualification point of view, you know, what's the motivation? What's the timing? You know, will they do something before this date? Asking the sales agent, and they all have their ego being stroked, as we know. He's saying to the sales agent, you know, you've got 23 Smith Street online, you're the local expert, stroke the ego, and say essentially, look, there's no price guide on it. What do you think the most direct comparable sale is recently? Get them to tell you a comp. Like 23 Smith Street down the road that sold for $1,010,000. Great. So it's asking the questions to sort of peel the layers back outright of what every typical buyer does. He's ring and says, what are they chasing for it? And the sales agent will say something like, oh, that, you know, early millions. Oh, okay, I'll come and have a look Saturday. Like, is that $1,010,000? Is it 1.2? There's a big swing there, right? So I think diving into that, but just educating yourself with things like, you know, podcasts or like just pick people's brains. Like information is key. It really is.
And that's, I think, the purpose of an open home. Like agents hold them to get information from the market to allow their sellers to hopefully make good decisions.
Yeah.
It's your time to get information about the market and about that property from the agent. It's not a 5-minute hot lap where you don't turn taps on or you don't turn lights on or off, right? It is, how can I make them? I've given up my Saturday to go to these 4 or 5 properties. I want to get more out of it than an A4 laminated brochure.
Correct. It's such a good point, right? Because, yeah, it's interesting when you look at it through that lens because there's so many buyers, whether you're a buyer or a browser, and two very different things as well, right? Where you're going through, spending all your time on REA, contacting agents, and you'll go and you'll have a 30-second with the agent, 30-second conversation with the agent for potentially what might be the biggest financial decision of your life. Crazy when you think about it, right?
We talk about it all the time. Like, it's ridiculous that you'll spend a couple $1 million on a 20-minute decision.
It's wild. And a lot of buyers, you know, like, yeah, they'll look at a property for 20 minutes, make the decision, not even go back. They won't even turn the building and pest. Like, it's scary. Yeah. It really is. I think you need to do your due diligence, right? Which obviously you know very much about. But yeah, asking the right questions, looking at the comparable sales. And then I think getting a little bit more granular with it in the sense that outside of everything on face value, like what are the neighbouring properties like? You know, and just, I guess, you know, aspect, how much natural light is there? Is there any cross breezes? People don't look at livability or functionality enough, in my opinion. Definitely owner rocks. Investors probably aren't as concerned for obvious reasons. But I think it's very easy to walk into a property that's staged, it's photographed beautifully, and get caught up in it. One piece of advice to a buyer is, outside of just asking a heap of questions to the agent, is just stop 5 or 10 seconds, look around and start to look through it through a different lens, right? Because otherwise you make a decision that's not entirely informed and that's where you make a mistake.
We say to people all the time, sit on the couch.
That's a good one. I might start doing that myself.
How often do you get home and stand in your living room?
Yeah,
right?
You don't.
You don't. You sit on the couch and it's a different house, right? Genuinely it is. And again, having that time to just be still and think, would I sit on this couch? Is this staged couch where I will put my couch? Where would I put my couch? Can I go and sit over there, right? Just little things of like how you actually live. Turn the shower on is another thing, right? Like no one wants to have Seinfeld issues when they move into a house, right?
Definitely not.
You don't have those issues, mate.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you got me there.
But yeah, it's how do you go beyond marketing and make it really practical? I think your point of look at the surrounding houses makes a massive difference as well. Like whether you're living there or whether it's going to be investment. Like the 2 houses next door to you and probably the one behind you actually have an impact on the value of that home. Yeah. Today, when you're bidding on it or when you're making an offer, and into the future, if you ever do need to trade or just want to trade.
Fair call. Yeah. Very true.
Yeah. It's everything matters in real estate is probably beyond the marketing photos.
It is.
You said before there's a difference between buying a house and being sold a house. That's probably the most interesting thing that maybe has ever been said on this show, so I'm not letting you get away
Here
with
all
that.
day, mate. Here all day.
We said we're going to go for 20 minutes. I reckon we can still keep that. Talk me through the difference between buying a house and being sold a house.
Yeah, as I touched on before, I think, being sold a house it's lead or be led, right? So I think if you're being sold a house, you're being led by the sales agent, right? And they've obviously got a job to do, right? And I get it. We as buyers agents do as well. But if you're a general buyer, don't underestimate, and look, there's a lot of fantastic agents out there. I'm not shitting on them in any way, shape or form, but they are there to represent the vendor. Don't lose sight of that, right? I think you need to go into it with a very open mind, but keeping your own interest at the top of the list, and take everything that's being said or put in front of you with a grain of salt. Do your own DD. I mean, you should be doing this anyway, right? So I think when it comes to, inverted commas, being sold a property, it's just taking a step back, like we said before, and looking at it through a different lens. I think the view on buying a property and buying a property well, the process between the two, in my opinion, is probably drastically different, right? Like if you are walking through a car yard and the car yard salesperson comes out on the floor and says, this particular car is great, here's all the features for it, and you go, you know what, he's right. You've just been sold a car, right? Whereas if you've done all your research, you've narrowed down 2 dealerships that you want to deal with, you know which model you want and why, and you go in and you're saying to the car salesperson, hey, over the last couple of weeks, I found out what's important to me. The list is X, Y, and Z. I had a look online. I believe you've got one of those here. Can you show me it? Then you go through the process and transact. That's buying a car. 2 very different things,
For sure.
in my opinion.
So you're being lead or be led. You're being more proactive than
100%.
just relying on an agent's floor plan, some beautiful curated photography, and an auction date.
Correct.
Okay.
Spot on.
Cool.
Spot on.
I'm into that. Let's talk about negotiation, because I think again, that's probably a big part of buying versus being sold. And I certainly in our experience, we found that, again, I'll use that example of we've been in the market 4 weeks. We decided to buy a house, and for 4 weeks we thought we're never going to buy a house because we haven't found something. And then suddenly something appears, right? There it is. And it's the 1 in 3 months house. So you go to the open home and there's 45 other groups there. That is just the common scenario for so many buyers, whether they're first home buyers or family home buyers in Brisbane. Like, the good real estate doesn't last, and it usually attracts really good people. And there's probably only 1 or 2 every 3 months. That is a 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
I've made my offer. The agent said that's not going to buy it, whether they've counted or they've asked me to come back with more. What advice can you give everybody listening to hold their ground a little bit more, to at least test motivations before shelling out the extra cash or bringing that settlement forward, or whatever it might be? How do you say no before you have to say yes, to give yourself every chance of maybe buying a little bit better?
It's a good question. And look, the harsh reality is there's so many different situations and scenarios that can play out, right? Number one, let's talk about owner-occupiers, right? I'll use that as the example because it's probably slightly different, because the motivation is different between owner-occs and investors when it comes down to the numbers and the numbers only. I think, number one, keep the emotion out of it. That's the obvious one, because emotion is the biggest price driver, which is why sales agents love auctions, because they're emotionally charged, right? So I think keep the emotion out of it where you can. I think when it comes to negotiating hard, is have all the information. I know we touched on it before, right? But the comparable sales, the motivation of the vendor, is there an ideal time frame they're looking to get it done outside of how it's being marketed, right? Because some people will put a property to auction, but they'll sell prior.
For sure.
Right? But people don't ask the question. They think, shit, I just got to sit here and wait for 4 weeks and, wave my paddle around. Not the case. I think the other factor is when it comes to negotiating, I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of the relationship with the sales agent. It is huge.
Between the buyer or and the agent, or between the seller and the agent?
No. So if you're a buyer, the relationship that you have as a buyer with the sales agent.
And how they perceive you.
Yeah. The reality is too, in a market that we're in, buyers are lining up down the street, right? So ask yourself the question, if you're a buyer and there's 5 other people that are looking to put offers forward outside of price, what gives you a point of difference, right? If you have the agent on side and you've built enough rapport with that agent, they're not going to, outright do you any favors when it comes to price, because they're representing the vendor, but they will assist you and probably tell you a little bit more than the next person. So I think the relationship that you've got with the agent is probably honestly towards the top of the list out of this, right? I think that's where a lot of buyers fail, because if they're looking in a cluster of 3 or 5 suburbs, and it's the 80-20 rule, right? That there's agents that are selling 80% of the stock, as an example. I think what happens with that is a buyer will go through 3 or 5 suburbs and they'll deal with 3 or 5 agents over and over. But the reality is there's probably another 50 that transact in that suburb or surrounds, but they're not talking to them. So they'll build relationships, but only with a small pool. And again, without trying to sound biased, that's the benefit of using a buyer's agent, because they've got relationships with all of them, right? But I just think there's so many things that can play out. It's knowing how to make a decision quick and on the spot. You know, a lot of people talk about timeframes on offers and that, and we do it from time to time, pretty rare, because I think in some cases it can actually work
Gets everyone's back up
against
for sure.
you.
Particularly when you're a buyer's agent, I think there's a sense from a seller like they're trying to get one over me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the shift has also changed as time has gone on between sales agent and buyer's agent too, whereas it used to be sort of more butting heads, and I know that there's buyer's agents out there that sort of do go down that path without mentioning any names, but it's more, if you've got the right relationship, it's smooth, everyone's got a job to do, everyone wants a desired outcome, which is to get a deal, but it still needs to make sense for the client on both sides.
100%.
Right? And I think that's the beautiful thing, when you can get a negotiation in place and get a deal, wrapped up and everyone's happy, like that's the holy grail, right? As opposed to one party feeling like they've probably been fucked over a bit.
All right, love that. All right, I got 2 more questions in 2 more minutes for you. And
yeah, let's do it.
Right. My view on the current market, and we're talking about this early November, this will come out mid-November, is that all bar the sort of 9 out of 10s, the market's probably as fair as it's been in 18 months right now. It's not that 1% growth every single month. There's options for people to buy before auction. There's options for people to buy pre-market, off-market, to make fair offers on properties that may or may not have a price and get deals done, versus it's going to best and finals or we're taking it through to auction. There'll be 4 or 5 registered bidders. Yeah. How's your feeling on the market, and what advice do you have for people to get a deal done in the next 4 weeks so that they're sitting at Christmas lunch going, fuck yeah, we bought a house? Advice
or my view on the market, I love the market that we're in because it's more predictable and sustainable. I think if you go back a couple of years when, like most capital cities had that significant run, call it 30-40%, I mean, it was great and it was fantastic for our business. But, the reality is it was never going to last, right? And I think there was so much pain and frustration from a buyer's perspective in the market, which is why it was great for us and probably a lot of other buyer's agents. But I think the market we're in now is probably more enjoyable because there's a little bit more pressure taken off in negotiation situations. I think buyers are probably feeling a bit better about deals that they're getting because it was the Wild West back then, right? It literally was.
It might be higher prices now, but it feels fairer.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's a very good way to put it. Second question, advice to buyers over the period. I think, so 2 things. I think the old saying of don't wait to buy and wait still holds a lot of weight. I know it's a cliche and everyone says it, right? But what I would say additional to that is, like, you've got to do something different to every other buyer. So the perfect example of that is, as we know, Melbourne Cup rolls around, which has now come and gone while we're filming this. And then it's just this slow grinding halt into Christmas and then typically picks up again from Australia Day onwards, right? A lot of buyers start to leave the market, school holidays, they go overseas, they switch off, all the rest of it. And typically online listings slow as a result of that. But what you also see is a lot of vendors in December getting ready. They're painting the fence, they're fixing the gutters, whatever it may be, right? But they're getting ready to launch to market in January. So my advice to a buyer would be, do not take your foot off the gas because of the holiday period. Build as many relationships as you can. That is where you're going to get the most access to often pre-market property out of any time of the year. So if a buyer zigs, you zag, build the relationships and you'll get access to more than you probably think.
On that bombshell, Darren Piper, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.